In the previous section of this tutorial, we knit the first 6 rounds. This is the bottom where we started, and we knit the first 6 rounds, doing some increases. And then we knit about 59 rounds to have a total of about 65 rounds. In felting, your measurements and your gauge does not have to be precise. So when I give you measurements and gauge and other calculations like that, these are estimates and do not have to be precise at all. If you are within the range that makes you comfortable, you just go right ahead. It's absolutely fine. And I knit kind of loosely, so my knitting might look a little bit different from yours. This took me from the time I did the first 6 rounds, and then I started knitting up. I started one afternoon about 2:30, and I knitted pretty hard the rest of that afternoon. Took a break, had dinner, knitted some more in the evening. I got up the next day and I had done, I think, approximately 48 or 49 rounds. So then I was able to finish the knitting to round 65, about round 65, in just a couple of days. The pattern has some measurements. Again, these are estimates only to let you know what mine looks like and the range that you might want to be in. Mine is about 19 inches long. The pattern calls for it to be 18 inches. That's absolutely fine. That's fine with me. The pattern calls for it to be about 12 inches wide. It's more like 13. That's good. No problem. Rather be a little bit too big than a little bit too small, but a little bit too small is just fine as well. And keep in mind that this 12 inches is a cross. This 13 inches is a cross. So that makes it 26 inches around. And what you need to keep in mind to think about what it's going to look like after it's felted is that you're going to experience shrinkage in this direction of about 35%. So you might lose a third in the length of the knitted bag. Across this way, you'll probably experience shrinkage about 21%. So you will lose not quite a quarter of the width of this bag. And what I sometimes do is I take the piece that I've knitted and I think, okay, well, that looks like about a third. So if it shrinks a third, it might be about that long. And okay, well, that looks about 20%. So let me fold it that way. And okay, well, maybe my bag would turn out to be about that big. And again, very imprecise. So if it shrank that much, it would be 11 by approximately 9 or 10 inches, which would be ideal size and shape for a bag. That would work very, very well and certainly be a successful project. Next, we're going to do some decreases and purl rounds, and we'll talk about how to create the strap, an optional flap if you would like a closure flap with a buttonhole, and we will need to seam this bottom of the bag. You will see that I almost always make the first stitch on the next round. As I finish off a round, I will go ahead and make a knit stitch on the next round just to keep my marker in place. Even if I have to come back and take that stitch out and make it a purl or make it a different stitch, I go ahead and do that first stitch. So that's why you usually see that there's my marker and there's my first stitch in the round. So this is my second stitch in the round. And if I'm going to make a decrease, there's a couple of different ways to do that. Of course, there's many different ways to do that. The most common is knit two together, which you can use throughout. I will show you other decreases, but you may use the knit two together throughout this entire pattern and tutorial and be successful. That was knit two together, and I'll show you again. Here's my first stitch of the round, and on the next stitch is going to be a decrease, and that will be a knit two together. Another way to decrease is to slip one, knit one, pass that slip stitch over. And that's what I prefer to do for a left leaning decrease. But the knit two together will work just as well, but I'll show you that one again. This is called slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over. And the way you'll see it in patterns is it will say slip one, knit one, PSSO. That's for pass the slip stitch over. So there's a couple of different ways to do decreases, and those are the only two ways that I'm going to discuss here. I'm going to do left leaning, which will be the slip one, knit one, pass the slip stitch over in some circumstances, and I'm going to do the knit two together in others, and I will tell you which one to use if you would like to use the two different ones. But if you use knit two together throughout, this will be a successful project. I used to do that all the time. I didn't always know how to do the slip one, knit one, pass, slip stitch over. I didn't always know how to do that. So for a long time, I did all my decreases as knit two together. And because it's going to be felted, that will work absolutely fine. So as you knitted up your bag, you're creating the front and the back of the bag. It doesn't matter which is which. At this point, you don't have to know which is the front and which is the back. It's just important that they're the same as we work in the round. And as we talked about when we did the increases, we created this curve with those increases. And although it's not as easy to see here at the top, we're also creating a curve there at the top. And we're going to do some decrease rounds to create that curve. And we're going to purl every other round, which helps with the shaping of the top of the bag as you felt it. It just makes it have a better shape at the end of the felting process if you do some purl rounds between your decrease rounds. And so the markers I use mark the beginning of the round and the center of the round. Here's the moment of sentiment in the tutorial. My very, very dear auntie sent me this stitch marker a long, long time ago. I remember where I lived when she sent it to me. And it was a beautiful bauble, but I didn't know what it was. I hadn't been knitting very long, and I really didn't know what it was, but I kept it. I even kept it in a little dish I had next to me on my end table. So it was right there, and it made me think of her. And then one day, as I was knitting along, I thought, I need a marker. And that's what that is. So I have this lovely little flower stitch marker that my aunt gave me. And luckily I figured out what it was and was able to use it and thank her for it. My other stitch marker is a little sheep. and I don't really remember where I got this one. It's possible that my friend gave it to me for Christmas, but I recently bought some things for myself, so let's say my friend gave it to me for Christmas. Let's say that. Okay. The decreases are placed much like the increases were. For the decrease round, this marker marks the beginning of your round. You would knit the first stitch, make a decrease, knit to within 3 stitches of the next marker, and make a decrease. Knit, slip that marker, knit, create a decrease, knit around to 3 stitches from the next marker, make a decrease, and knit that final stitch. So you have been knitting around approximately 72 stitches. Precision is not necessary. If you're off a couple of stitches, don't be concerned. So you've been knitting around 72 stitches, creating the front and the back of the bag, and now that you have decreased 4 stitches, you have 68 stitches. And the next round is a purl round. I knit continental and I also purl continental. So if you have a different way of making your purl stitches, you do it how it makes sense to you. For my purl stitch, and I have already made the first one in my round, for my purl stitch I have my yarn in front of my needle, put my right needle from right to left under that stitch, catch the working yarn, pull it through, and drop off that stitch, and there's my first purl stitch, and I will make a few more for you. You can see I use my middle finger to pull that yarn over the needle so I can pull it through the loop and pull the loop off the needle. And there's some purl stitches. Nice large tools, nice large stitches. Purl all the way around, 68 purls. The next round, after you purl the 68, the next round will be another decrease round. Decrease 4 stitches, just as you did on the round we just did together. Then you'll have 64 stitches. Purl another round, do another decrease round, purl another round, and then bind off. And all of this is in the pattern. Don't try to follow my verbal instructions here about how many rows you're supposed to do and where you're supposed to put the decreases. Refer to the pattern, comment, or email me when you have done the decrease and purl rounds. Like I said, then the next thing would be the bind off. So I will come back to show you the bind off. For the bind off, the first thing I recommend is that you let this marker slip off your hook and set it aside someplace safe. I can't tell you how many markers I've misplaced by not setting them aside as I do the bind off round. Bind off is quite easy. If you've made it this far, the bind off isn't going to be a big challenge for you. To bind off the very first stitch, knit 2. 1, 2. And then that first stitch that you've knit, pick it up and pull it over the tip of your needle, pass it over the knit stitch, and you have bound off 1. Knit again. Pick up the stitch with your needle, pass it over. Now you've bound off 2. And so you continue this way, binding off loosely. Try not to pull these stitches tight at all. I think you can see that I'm letting my stitches be very loose as I'm making the bind off. You can even use a larger size needle to do the bind off if that's helpful to keep those stitches nice and loose. I thought it might be helpful for you to see a few more of the bind off stitches. This is where I've been binding off. Nice large stitches. It's a bit stretchy. It's not as stretchy as the knit fabric, but my bind off is stretchy because I am making my bind off stitches very large on purpose. And as I said, you could even use a larger knitting needle to do the bind off if you wanted to be assured that your stitches were going to be large. You don't need to do a stretchy bind off. This doesn't need to be stretchy. It just doesn't need to be tight. So I thought to show you a few more bind off stitches, I'd come around here to my marker that marks the middle of my round and remind you again to take care with these markers and be sure to slide it off and set it aside. Otherwise, you're going to be looking in your couch cushions, your floor, your shoes, goodness knows where your stitch markers might get to. And you can tell I've experienced that a few times, quite a few times. I get so excited that I'm at the stage where I'm binding off, I drop those stitch markers that I've had on my needles the whole time I was knitting. So here's a few more bind off stitches. We are binding off knitwise. And that just means we're knitting the stitches to bind them off. You could bind off purlwise if the pattern called for it, or any number of ways. But this is binding off knitwise. We've bound off a stitch, and here we knit another one and bind off. I'm to the final couple of stitches on the bind off of this bag, and I thought I'd show you those last couple of stitches. I have some different needles because I'm using those other needles to make the other bag like this. Like I said, I'm making 2 of each, the knit and the crochet. So I've started the other one, and I have the needles I was using previously on that bag. So here I am, I have 2 stitches left, one on my right needle, one on my left. I'm going to knit that final stitch, and I do want my stitches to be large, that's fine. Pull that stitch over, and then you can just go ahead and finish off right there. But to me, that leaves a funny looking gap right there. And yes, you want your stitches to be loose, but I think it needs a little bit better of a finish off right there. So many years ago when I was first learning to knit, I actually took my knitting into the local yarn store when we still had one and asked her what to do about this funny looking little gap right there that you actually can live with, but it's also very easy to close. Just make another stitch by slipping in the next stitch pulling up a loop, and now you have 2 stitches again. Make 1 more bind off stitch, and then cut your yarn. Or if you're going to continue, don't cut your yarn. Consider carefully before you cut your yarn, because that second after I cut my yarn, and I wish I hadn't, it's not a good second. Anyway, there's the finish off that looks quite a bit tidier. There is a little gap there that will close in felting, but the work itself comes together, makes a nice finish, and we're ready to move on to the seaming of the bottom of the bag. Here we are at seaming the bottom of the bag, which I've probably mentioned a few times on the way here. I think this is going to be kind of difficult for me to show it to you very well. I am going to do so. I will show it to you and talk about it. But I also am going to provide at least 3 links to YouTube videos that I feel are helpful with this technique. And I chose 3 different ones because everyone learns differently and sees things differently. I chose 3 that made sense to me, and I'll share with you the search that I used while looking for these videos. I searched for horizontal knit seam. This is our horizontal, and we are not doing a mattress stitch. We are doing a horizontal seam where we are joining a cast on edge to a cast on edge. The tutorials that I link and almost all the information that I find about this kind of join refer to a top piece and a bottom piece. And so you're joining the top piece to the bottom piece and creating a seam there. And we can think of our piece the same way. Although we're creating a seam here at the bottom of this bag, we certainly have a top piece and a bottom piece which have the same number of stitches and are both cast on and can be joined at this point with an invisible seam. Of course, we're going to start that seam where we started the bag, at the place where we made increases. And in our case, if we thought ahead, and I have not always thought ahead this way, if we've thought ahead, we have enough yarn from beginning our bag to make this seam. And I say, when I talk about how much yarn to leave your tail when you do the cast on, I mention how much yarn you should have. Refer to that. And I think I said about 3 yards, but go back and refer to that. Don't rely on my memory, and see how much yarn I said to leave for your tail so that you would have ample to seam here. If you don't have enough yarn to seam, join right here. Here's a method you can use to join your wool yarn that creates no ends to weave in and no knots. You can use this join throughout your project, whether you are joining a yarn of the same color or a yarn of a new color. Because, and this is your choice, but I say that you can use this method to join a yarn of a new color because usually in felting, even if you're changing colors and creating stripes, it's okay if those stripes aren't sharp and perfect. They don't have to be sharply defined and perfect because they're going to be felted. So it's okay if you join another color in this way. So I'm just going to break this yarn and then show you how to join it. And I do recommend breaking rather than cutting your yarn that you're going to join. So if you have an end that you're going to join and it's been cut off with the scissors, break off a piece and create a more frayed end. So I'm going to break off a length of yarn for myself to rejoin. And see, that doesn't create a very tidy end. And then I'm just going to open these plies and maybe remove one of the plies. Just easy to do. And the same thing on the other yarn that I am joining. Open those plies and get rid of one or two of them. I usually just do one. Now, some people recommend that you very carefully intertwine these pieces of yarn and join them perfectly as though they were woven together. I don't find that's necessary, especially if you're felting. So what you need to do, see, there's our two pieces of yarn, and I'm just going to lay them together. And because they're wool, they really do want to stick together. They would like to stick together. So I'm going to wet those pieces of yarn. This is no special water. It doesn't have to be warm or hot. It just has to be wet. Make sure they're good and wet. And then we're actually going to felt this together by hand. And to do that, just lay it in your palm with those ends and rub it back and forth all along that spot where you've joined. Look, we're felting all along the spot where you've joined those two bits of yarn. And it will felt together and become a solid join in just a few minutes. If you need to, add a little bit more water, but usually a good soaking like that is enough. And you see, you can still kind of see where they join, but it's going to join, and it's going to be a solid join that holds when you knit or crochet, and then it won't show at all when you felted the whole finished product. Even while it's still wet, it's not going to separate. And there's no ends to weave in and no knots. It's a great join for wool yarns. Now, this is called a wet splice. I should have said that at the beginning. This is called a wet splice. It actually works best with spit. It's called a spit splice. I'm not going to do that on camera. It works just fine with water, but you can do it with spit if you choose to. And if you're having a little bit of trouble getting those fibers to join, a little bit of spit will get them to stick. So there's how you join your wool yarns. In the book that I learned from this technique from, the book Stitch and Bitch, and I believe the author's name is Debbie Stoller, they call this fake grafting. So that's another name that you can search for it for. So, like I said, the tutorials, and we are going to approach this as though this is our top piece and this is our bottom piece. That's where we're joining, right there. And you can see along here that there are stitches shaped like V's. You can see the V's. And if you turn this over, you can also identify V's right there along the edge. And those are the stitches we're going to work in, the V's. This is one of the references I mentioned. I bought this book before I learned to knit. So I feel like I learned to knit from this book. Now, I learned only the fundamentals here, and I had to have some help getting good at correcting mistakes, picking up stitches, doing more complex things. But I learned my continental knitting from this book, and I continue to rely on it as a reference. Like I said, the basics, and I have referred to this book so much it's fallen apart, and I don't have to wonder where the page is for the fake grafting because that's where the book is broken. So this is where I learned to do the technique that I'm going to show you. And like I said, I'll link this book, and I will link some other references down below. This is where we're going to start our seam. We're going to make a seam along here. And of course we want an equal number of stitches on this part of our seam as we have on this part of our seam. So we want to start in the middle, and you can count and place a marker. Most certainly you can count your stitches and place a marker at the other end of the seam and know that you have an equal number of stitches. But again, with felting, if you make a mistake or two, that's not going to make a difference in your finished product. So don't be concerned if this doesn't turn out perfect. And this technique creates an invisible seam, so it doesn't really have to be perfect for it to turn out pretty nice. Again, the tutorials you'll see and what you'll see in this book is it refers to a top and a bottom piece. Begin by securing your yarn in the first opening of the bottom piece. If this were your bottom piece and you were making it, this would be the first opening. Secure your yarn in there. And I do have quite a long piece of yarn. It's the way I like to do it. Next, come over to this is the bottom side, this is the top side, and go under that V. Make a stitch. Come back over here and go in right where you attached your yarn before and come up in the middle of the V. Again, your yarn doesn't have to be that long. That is a long habit. I like my long yarn tail. Come back over here, go in the same space, go around that V, back over here, go in where you came out and back up into the center of the next V, and continue in this way. I want to make a few stitches and then give it a little tug and see what our seam looks like. Pretty well invisible. Certainly not going to show when it's felted. So continue in that way all the way across. I recommend not pulling it tightly. You can give it a tug to make the stitches come together so it looks nice there. But don't pull it too tightly. And see where I've made the seam? It flows from the front of the bag to the back of the bag, and it looks like a row of knitting because of this join, because of the way we're creating this join. And it doesn't take very long. Once you get started with your rhythm, and especially if you don't have yarn tail that's too long, it doesn't take long to make your way across the bottom of this bag and have the bag all seamed. Something about that invisible seam makes me very happy. This is the seam at the bottom of the bag, and I'm here to the last few stitches. I think I mentioned that if you're off a couple of stitches along the way, don't be concerned about that. It doesn't have to be exact or precise. You should have the same number of stitches on the top as the bottom and be able to match them up as you go along. But if you get off a stitch or two, don't worry about that until you get to the end, because you do want your end to be at this fold where you've made the increases. So if at this point it's clear to you that you have more or less stitches on one side, you could take a few stitches out or just skip one. Just skip one so that as you get to the end here, it's looking even. And the reason I suggest maybe unpick a few stitches and go back, skip one further back here, not so close to the very end of your final stitches where you're bringing this closure together. And take care not to pull this too tight as you do these last stitches. You want these two corners where you began and where you end the seam to look the same. So I'm going to finish up here with my final stitches of the seaming of the bottom of the bag. And I wanted to show you too that when I get to this point, I often put my hand in there, and then it's easier for me to see those last stitches and where I need to place my needle. It just gets a little trickier as you get here to the end, as most things do, the fiddly finishing. And I just pulled the yarn out of my needle, but you see what I mean. Stitch here to the end, make sure these final stitches are neat and not too tight, and if it doesn't look right to you, stop there, take a deep breath, and let me see it, and we'll get it fixed.